Hey everybody, welcome back. Nice to see so many people here. We are going to have a discussion session now with the title of Building Bridges Between Bubbles, Infrastructures, Immersion and Imagination. I'll just read you a little blurb that we wrote together, a little description, and then we'll introduce ourselves. And so we're aiming to have a discussion on the utopian possibilities and uncomfortable realities found at the junction between Web3 and the arts. The tabula rasa of blockchain technology has afforded a new architecture for imagination states, being heralded as no less than a new internet, and a radical break from the desubjectified state we live in under contemporary technofeudalism. As new digital commons bloom, political questions around influence, agency, and control still linger. Blockchains, through DeFi, decentralized finance, NFTs, non-fungible tokens, and DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, create a new bubble with which to germinate eco-techno-socio-political ideologies. As always, with every affordance comes an implication, an externality. What is the price of the decentralized dream of empowerment? This is not the first time that decentralization has provided the promise of technologically fueled social emancipation. How much promise do these technologies hold in overcoming human social coordination challenges and creating genuine, lasting, attentional engagement to a shared cause? Can these technologies truly deliver liberation of the protocollatariat? And so, yes, we're going to introduce ourselves now. I'll hand it over to one of you to do that.
Yes, I will start. Hi, my name is Paul Seidler. I'm like an artist and researcher. I explore mainly economic systems and computational systems, specifically in questions regarding decentralized ledgers, so blockchain technology. I started with this in 2015, 2016, and I have various projects which continue on this sort of exploration. One of them is TerraZero, which is a project which is interested in the question how the commons or ecology can essentially interact with the sphere of economics and decentralized ledgers. The other thing I'm involved with is a exit production studio, I call it, with a friend. It's called Nathan, and we consult essentially sort of institutions and work with institutions to see what new ways of engagement are possible through these technologies.
Hi, and I'm Laura Lotti. I'm a researcher and writer, and I work primarily on governance and economic mechanisms in relation to DAOs and protocols. I work with an organization called Other Internet, where we explore a lot of these dynamics and also focusing a lot on the social dynamics that occur around and through and sometimes in spite of these mechanisms that are codified through blockchains. And I'm also co-developing a project called Black Swan that uses blockchain thinking as a methodology to role-play and role-play the mechanisms of some of these decentralized autonomous organizations with the goal to catalyze an alternative cultural environment in Berlin, which is where the project is starting.
And hi everybody, I'm Wassim Alsindi. So I'm the founder and creative director of a para-institutional research collective called the 0x Salon. We run an event series in Berlin, produce literary and creative outputs and provocations. I'm a de-radicalized Bitcoin maximalist, having spent most of a decade in that space. I founded MIT's crypto journal. I worked in their Bitcoin research group. These days I edit a law journal, also at the MIT Media Lab. I have designed legal epistemologies and compliance frameworks. And these days I'm mostly engaged in artistic provocations around Web3 and blockchain space. We recently developed improvised radio play, satirical theatre production, and a computer game about Bitcoin boiling the oceans, tensions in technology governance, and all that good stuff. So yeah, I guess without any further ado, let's roll in. So there are a bunch of words in the title of this talk, and we thought that we could use those as jumping off points for our conversation. So the first one is building. And I thought I would set the scene by talking a little bit about what I think that to mean in the context of all of this stuff. So one of the most incredible and amazing things about these decentralized technologies, such as, first it was cryptocurrencies, then it generalized out to blockchains, and now we talk about it more in terms of Web3 and tokenization, is that anything you can imagine that is within the bounds and the constraints of the protocols and the networks that provide the technological scaffold, you can build it. Almost nobody can stop you. And so there's this concept of permissionless innovation. And so, we have this idea of if you build it, they will come. And there's no guarantee that anyone will actually come, but we can build almost anything we can dream. But I would then counterpoint that with the fact that despite the fact that we can build almost anything with these technologies, we seem to be replicating and recreating a lot of the things that we've seen before again and again. And so I wonder if anyone has any thoughts about building or biddling, as many Web3 people prefer to call it.
I would maybe jump in there and just talk about something which I'm currently really concerned with, which is the question of a priori of software or of hardware essentially, and the question of what essentially how hardware and software to a certain degree are almost determined by certain ideologies and by certain things which came into the building process. And I think one of the questions is for me always, if the software or the hardware itself can overcome these issues, or can essentially almost subsume these as the hacker ideology would say, right? As a hacker, you would say, okay, we can go in these technologies and we can repurpose them completely, and through using them can find new definitions for them. Or if we are always predetermined to these kind of conceptualizations of how society would work in these kind of technologies. And I think that's for me an interesting two positions in a sense, which I think we both find in the Web3 space,
I'm just asking another question. Do you have any tentative answer or position between these two, kind of almost opposed ways? Or do you think that there's a way maybe to overcome this?
Yeah.
This is a big question.
I think it's pretty hard to see. I think it's something which is played out almost with any sort of technology. And in a sense, I think I'm more on the pessimistic side, as I think the ways which or how the technology is then used. And I think we see this with Web3. Tends to be almost always more on the side of the commercial side of things. So more in the question of how can this technology used for freeing market dynamics, for example, rather than protecting the commons.
Yeah.
I guess one of the things we should say to render things a bit more explicit and clear is when we use this term of Web3 and talk about projects that are using Web3 logics, infrastructure and tools, they almost always have a cryptographic token attached to them. And it seems to be, at least it's borne out in the history to date of these networks and protocols and projects, is that once there's a token, it's all about the token. Or it's very hard to get away from the fact that we're creating these highly speculatable objects, and then they naturally lend themselves well to market logics and all of the other capitalist stuff that we know and love or otherwise.
Yeah. When you said this narrative or ideology of building and they will come, building because it's possible, made me think about the some kind of differences within particularly the Web3 space. The idea of community has become really important as that which sustains and keep moving this machine basically. And something that I've realized, working both with projects in Web3 and with the projects that are maybe more experimental, is that there is a big difference between crypto communities, like these communities that gather around this token or this magical object that maybe doesn't have a defined meaning or use, but catalyzes a lot of attention. And on the other side, communities that already exist that maybe want to start to, experiment with some of these tools to try and maybe create something that sits outside of the current structures. But that also opens up a lot more challenges, for instance. So yeah, I guess that's also something quite interesting that's happening. I think I want to believe that there's still opportunities to, maybe come up or articulate alternative ways of, running a organization or a collective project. But yeah, within the commercialization of Web3, there is also a lot of the same old patterns that are repeated.
Yeah, but I like this sort of distinction you made between sort of communities which are sort of there and were there before, and sort of these sort of more synthetic ways of how a community is formed, more in almost commercial way, or more in a way of how can we pump the price of this token essentially. And I think one of the main argumentations for this whole space, this whole Web3 space in the beginning, was essentially that the peer-to-peer movement failed because no one could pay the people who work there, and there was a lot of unpaid labor there. And so I think this is a really interesting sort of question. Maybe it needs both. Maybe it needs sort of both sides, right? As you said,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like we're not far away from this concept of the tragedy of the commons, which is probably a reasonable place to start. It's maybe a little bit of a tired analogy now, and it probably doesn't capture the fullness of what is possible and what happens. But the general idea of the tragedy of the commons is that if there aren't resources available to sustain something, then it often falls on a very small number of shoulders to maintain or to keep things going in an altruistic sense. And we've seen this time and again in the open source movement before tokens, before all this cryptocurrency, Web3 blockchain stuff. Just think about all those little kind of open source software tools. There's even whole operating systems which are based on open source software like Linux. There are pieces of critical internet infrastructure which just one person is maintaining that. They wrote a bit of code 30 years ago and they never got paid to do anything with it. And then that person just stops maintaining it. So you can imagine the reasons why they might not be alive anymore. They might have to get a job. And then these things can fall apart or be co-opted. And there's an example in my mind, which is the NPM package manager, which is a Linux package manager, kind of like a way to install stuff on your operating system. And there was just one person maintaining this thing, and eventually, they got ground down into the dirt. And then somebody else came along and said, hey, I can help you maintain this. And then they inserted malicious code into the package manager, and that kind of messed a lot of stuff up. So you've got these we've seen these patterns play out. And the kind of, if I was to put on a hat of an optimistic techno booster, I might say, well, let's put a token in there. That'll solve everything. But again, that has implications.
Financialization.
Well, yeah, and then so the incentives change. So we just talked about this idea of open source software as being quite altruistic. So people believed in the idea that software should be open and free for everybody as an alternative to the kind of the capture of big tech, things like, whatever, Microsoft Windows or things like that. But yeah, so Web3 is kind of a third way, but as we said, but if you introduce these speculative objects as the putative mechanism of trying to fund all of this stuff, I mean, it might go great, but it might not. We don't know until we try. But sometimes with kind of mission critical pieces of infrastructure, it's a roll of the dice that it's fraught with risk.
I mean, it poses the inherent question of the political decision process, which is then sort of governing this sort of commons or this kind of software commons, right? And I'm also not 100% sure what. Obviously, there is no perfect solution, but I'm not sure if the solution of this should be always like bound to sort of capital, as it's like practiced now quite often. So I think it's more about like finding sort of like middle ways or like middle solutions where certain things can be like incentivized and certain other things probably don't have to be incentivized.
Yeah, for instance.
Hot take.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we are seeing it within the space of governance, which is basically another name for politics, that happen within these protocols and that are mediated through these tokens. Even though we have, a lot of history that shows us, a lot of histories from which we could learn, the basic model is to vote with tokens. It's basically voting with money, quote unquote. And so obviously this creates, very, weird dynamics, or like not weird, like just reproduces like a plutocratic system. But that's for instance.
Let's unpack plutocracy. They who own the gold make the rules. They who own the gold make the rules.
Yeah.
So if it's one token, one vote, and like Laura has 1 million tokens, Paul has 50 tokens, and I have 1 token, and we need to vote on something, then like we already know the outcome. It doesn't even really matter what Paul and I think. Like the decision is already made.
And this sounds like hypothetical, but it's not. Like we have actually like seen this kind of like exact situations play out in actual governance situations with decentralized protocols, and they have some like really similar problems. Like
Yeah, in fact, in the talk yesterday, we showed the slide of the voting process around the DAO, which was like this big disaster that happened on Ethereum in 2016. And there was this thing called a carbon vote, which was, again, like a 1 token, 1 vote, indicative referendum. That's how it was framed at the time, anyway. And one of the voters had 20% of the voting weight. And so, like, the thing is, that's what they show you. But actually, there are ways of hiding how many tokens you've got. If you split them across 50 addresses, like 50 bank accounts sort of thing, then it looks like it's lots of people voting. And that is like we're back in the theatre of Punch and Judy, sock puppets and things like that.
Yeah, I guess one of the, the maybe silver lining there is that at least these technologies are making a lot of these dynamics a lot more explicit because everything is transparent, which itself is not I guess it helps maybe to at least retroactively make sense of current political systems or current ways of, making decisions for a collective. And a lot of these dynamics that are ultimately driven by capital are at least in this phase made a lot more clear, and it becomes maybe possible to begin seeing if there's ways to, constrain certain dynamics or behaviors.
I mean, the great thing about sort of these technologies, like specifically like smart contracts, is that they're like programmable, right?
Yeah.
So they can be almost used in a best sense as sort of like test beds for things which haven't been tried out in the real world yet. Also because like I think institutional systems in the real world are really slow and are really hard to because like when a big institution fails, it really fails. But when like a small experiment, which is like done between, I don't know, like 200 people on the blockchain sort of like fails, no one like is in danger besides maybe 2 token holders or something. But in general, like the kind of the speed in which these iterations and experiments can be tested is way faster than I would say like in real world institutions.
Okay, if we're talking about new kinds of voting mechanisms that can mitigate these kind of structural and economic inequalities, maybe we can talk about an example, which is like, well, quadratic voting is the one that's on my mind. And I know that's something that Black Swan DAO has been trialing out in a kind of an off-chain setting. So using the logics of the ways that we can enact voting systems in these networks, but not using the networks themselves. So do you want to say something about QV and Black Swan?
Yeah, I can. So maybe I can introduce Black Swan a little bit more first. Black Swan is this artistic project that started in Berlin in 2018. And the goal has been to, since the beginning, to propose the idea of a DAO that back in those days was quite challenging or quite novel, to try and create an alternative environment, to like try and address the precarity of art workers in Berlin. And in the last couple of years in particular, we've developed a methodology that works a lot with role-playing games as a way to prefigure some of these organizational forms that can exist with a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization. And out of one of these experiments that we ran at Trust, a space in Berlin, with a few, with a series of participants, we tested different decision-making mechanisms for a collective of transdisciplinary practitioners to come to an agreement on how to use certain resources, like certain funds that were made available. And so the voting system or the decision-making system that at the end resulted like the one that people felt more comfortable with is quadratic voting, which is this system that basically provides a way that is a bit more nuanced that the one token, one vote, or one person, one vote to express preferences across a set of proposals or ideas. And so the way in which it works, or the way in which then Black Swan has developed it into a voting application that exists, is like online, currently is in beta version, is basically the basis is that every person every member of this group has the same number of tokens, but expressing a higher preference, cost proportionally or exponentially more for each preference that one expresses. It sounds a bit complicated, but basically there are these voice credits that people can allocate across proposals, and then basically out of that allocation, the square root is taken, so that's the final vote. So that even someone with, someone who would want to allocate all their hundreds voice credits on a single project, the final vote would result as 10, like the square root. But for instance, if someone wanted to instead allocate 25 tokens across 4 projects, that would count as like a 5 effective votes per proposal. So effectively, each person there would have, like, the person that spreads their votes more evenly would have a higher like general weight on the final decision. So it's a way to mitigate particularly this one token, one vote model that is the one that is the most used in blockchain governance. And it's been working, quite nicely. We've tested it with quite a few communities within Berlin. Now we're working towards open sources and releasing this application so that basically any group could use it.
The Black Swan experiments were really interesting. I was part of those, and I remember at the working group in Trust, there was a very interesting kind of parallel experiment where there were 3 voting mechanisms being used, and we kind of trialed how different members of the working group would express their preferences across. It was like a lottery, veto.
There was a lottery. There was a
simple majority.
Vote. Yeah, similar like emoji vote, and there was this quadratic voting that we tested within the Discord server where the community was like,
Unfortunately, there was a bad actor in the working group that attempted to bribe people with one set of votes to get their preferred preference on the other ones. And I can speak candidly about that because I was the bad actor.
But that's also what's been really good is like having these analog experiments in a way as a way to really test also the limits maybe of each of these mechanisms or these like models. And in a way, yeah, we encouraged people to try and break the system.
So those are kind of like emergent dynamics of governance. That wasn't something that was anyone anticipated.
Yeah.
It was just like something that arose out of the ether. Yeah, and that's something that I think we see that borne out again and again in the blockchain space. People design these systems, whether they're like network protocols or whether they're kind of like applications that live on top of a blockchain. And despite the best intentions and due diligence of the designers, they may be used in unanticipated ways. And as the complexity of the systems and the way that they're interconnected increases, we see these kinds of exploitations happening more and more.
Did we define actually DAOs in the beginning of the talk? Did someone define like what a DAO is actually?
No.
Should we do this maybe?
I guess so.
Do you want to do this?
I mean, okay, so there's three words in the acronym, which are decentralized, autonomous, and organization. Now, personally, I take umbrage with all three of those words in terms of what we actually see today. So you could argue that a lot of these things aren't very decentralized. I mean, decentralization is a very slippery term anyway. You could argue that some of these things aren't particularly decentralized in any sense of the word. They're not autonomous because it's humans using these things. And a lot of them seem pretty disorganized to me.
It's also quite interesting maybe to look at these as like historical constructs, right? Because they were like they came up in a time where the technology was actually not super like in the middle, but it was more like an almost like ideological discussion in a sense, that people were interested in the autonomy of smart contracts and like imagined like DAOs as almost this sort of automated institutions which wouldn't have like people in the core anymore, but like just code in the core, and the code would like decide everything, and people would just be like on the outer edge and sort of the kind of ants which are running around the robot brain. And now we kind of seeing a little bit like how this is actually like implemented, and it's kind of like interesting also like from a media perspective to see how this came from this autonomous organization thing to essentially a Discord running on good vibes.
Yeah, so the D could stand for Discord at this point. It could. I think we could actually talk about TerraZero at this point. TerraZero is a kind of a crypto land art project that was founded in the early days of Ethereum. Paul's one of the members of that. And I think there's been a really interesting evolution over the years, like as TerraZero has mutated, as the blockchain space has also mutated. I wonder if you could say something about like where you and your colleagues were in 2016 when you wrote the position paper, which is like really a seminal text in the kind of crypto art movement, and where we are now.
Oh,
sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, I can talk about this project so long because essentially, like, I spent like the last it feels like 10 years which I work now on this. It's not like 10 years, but it feels like 10
1 year in crypto is 1 million human years.
Yeah, so. But essentially it was born out of the situation where essentially smart contracts were more akin to, or where people thought smart contracts are more akin to something like in soft AI. So where you could see like an institution becoming almost like an automated, like kind of, an automated brain or like an automated robot in a sense. And it came from this really sort of naive standpoint where we were like, okay, what actually could this thing do? And we were also in the beginning quite interested in like smart contracts as almost like the administration of capital, or the autonomous administrator of capital, as you could say. And one of the use cases, or one of the things we found interesting, was what would happen, or like what systems need this autonomy, or what systems could you give this autonomy to where it does make some sense, or where it generates some interesting scenarios. And we looked specifically at ecologic systems because there was also at this point the question of personhood, which were brought up by a huge sort of like ecologic movement, which was tied to a question of how personhood is constructed, but also how new ways of personhood can be like constructed through law, but also through other sort of methods. So Terra Zero is pretty much in this sort of direction, as we said, okay, maybe we can build this hybrid out of a smart contract and an ecosystem, and this thing could become almost like an autonomous ecosystem, but in a sense of the ecosystem actually sort of applied to like a material base, which could be like a forest, or which could be some sort of other ecological system. So in this sense, you could think of smart contracts almost like as a provider of autonomy for specific ecosystems, or for specific like natural, you could say natural capital, but that's itself a weird term. And through the years, we kind of had the same sort of development as the whole space had, which is essentially that a lot of the autonomy which is kind of seen in DAOs is actually rather socially constructed than it comes like from the technology itself. And a lot of the sort of decision-making processes in DAOs can't be done purely by code, but have to be rather done by actually humans or some sort of like oracles or some sort of like mixtures. I do think it's interesting that I have the feeling it's almost like a pendulum which sort of like swings. And at the beginning we were at full automation, now we're like at full social. And I think maybe it's something like in between. I think maybe it's not like super kind of weird to think of that there could be certain things which can be still sort of like fixed in protocols. And I think there are like a lot of the early sort of like smart contract kind of ideas which were around autonomy and around decision-making or like non-decision-making essentially are now found in certain protocols. Like when we look at protocols like RAI, for example, there is a pretty like, it's a stable coin which has almost like no governance and which is pretty much working through the contract itself. So you see some sort of like early smart contracts ideas maybe going more into the space of protocols, where it's then the question, maybe you don't need a decision-making process for certain protocols.
But the attention of the humans and the community around it are key. So maybe the A in DAO stands for attentional.
Yeah, there's definitely an attentional component. There's a component of having to put a lot of work into evaluating how to make decisions about something if you really care about it. The problem is that even though a lot of these protocols themselves can run according to a governance minimized approach where you don't really need to make that many decisions, there is always like a core group of developers or a core group of stakeholders that will have to make some kind of decisions. And Wassim, you've talked about it, how it works in Bitcoin and how there is this like cabal of core developers that basically make decisions whichever way they want, because the protocol itself can run like forever, kind of. But then we are seeing on the other side, in particularly in the world of DAOs, a lot of the work that goes into making these decisions is really human, and we are seeing like voters fatigue. People don't want to make decisions. A lot of responsibility, and at the moment, the majority of these DAOs do not even reward or like pay contributors to the decision making with like a fair kind of way of compensating people for their labor in this context. So
let's talk about the implications of that, which is like the kind of voter turnout in these governance mechanisms, the level of participation. And so like Laura, you are studying governance around Web3 and DAOs very deeply. As far as I understand, it's not uncommon to see kind of voter participation rates as a proportion of the kind of full token supply, let's say the full voting stock, of a few percent, a few in 100, 3% might be typical.
Yeah, because the only people that, or entities that generally vote or participate in these decisions are, venture capitalists or big investors that have obviously a vested interest in these protocols, but it's it's kind of like a theater of governance. It's very performative, while the decisions themselves are already made because you know what allocation is. Every account has.
I don't even think that's specific to Web3, because we were seeing this in governance, pre-Web3 governance systems, pre-Ethereum governance systems. I was studying what are called masternodes, these kind of multi-tiered Bitcoin-like networks. And we found evidence of like one guy or one wallet or like a small group of people like being the kind of swing voters, or even like in one protocol it was just one wallet was doing the voting. They had so many coins, they decided what was going on. And so that is your king. That is, we're back to that again.
I mean, also there is a technical sort of difference between, okay, you can vote on something and then how this will be implemented or if this will be implemented. So I think a lot of we have now this kind of vision that, okay, you vote on something and then or whatever is voted on is like implemented or is like really done by the people. But usually we see also in a lot of cases that like this is specifically not the case, but rather people vote on something and then it becomes, as you said, some sort of like theater where everyone's like, okay, this is the outcome, but you have like 5 developers in the end who like don't implement it or who like implement something else. So I think this like governance mechanisms itself, they have to be probably also better tied to actually sort of labor, but also to like the specific implementations of
accountability, perhaps. Yeah. So maybe the A stands for accountability, or lack thereof.
They're not very accountable at the moment, these organizations, even though a lot of the narrative and ideology around DAOs was also fueled by the idea that code is law. We are seeing now that actually code is not law, really, or there's a lot of nuances to make sure that accountability happens because there's no enforcement. At the moment, a lot of these organizations are not really accountable, in spite of the transparency, in spite of the explicitness, of how really these dynamics, financial, social dynamics, occur within the spaces.
Yeah, the other thing to say about code is law, and we touched on it a little bit yesterday, is these blockchain networks are like elephants. They don't forget. Like if you write something in the blockchain, you can't get it out. Well, it's very, very difficult to get it out. And so if you're invested in the concept of code being law, you need to be invested in that experiment until the end of time. And that is a big commitment to make, if you ask me.
Maybe at this point it's good to make like a privacy statement here, right? Because I think like what is often forgotten is, even if we talk about like pseudo-anonymity in this kind of blockchain systems, and if we talk about, okay, you might not be able to like trace everything, there are huge companies invested in doing exactly this and kind of monitoring transactions and essentially identifying payment processes on chain. So everything which is like not shielded and which is not like a sort of like using some like, I don't know, like a zero knowledge proof, something like this is actually visible to people, and this data is there and this data can be deciphered.
So the transparency and the verifiability and the auditability that blockchains afford, that is both a blessing and a curse simultaneously. And now as this space, the economic value contained within these protocols starts to get to the point where it moves the needle compared to nation states, stock markets, sovereign currencies, you can imagine that there's more and more attention from bigger and bigger actors on these things. And there's an example last year, around the time of the initial days of the invasion of Ukraine, or the escalation of that invasion, let's say, where many transnational organizations like, the European Union, European Central Bank, started scrambling to find ways to more tightly regulate the flows of cryptocurrencies because of the potential to use them to circumvent sanctions and things like that. And so, and also if we're going to talk about privacy, shall we talk about Tornado Cash? Like, this is a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's really important. So there's this, we talked about privacy just now, like the idea of covering our tracks. I think you're all very familiar with that. So there's a way of trying to get privacy, trying to cover your tracks on the blockchain, which we can think of roughly as coin mixing. Imagine you've got 10 5-zloty coins, and you put them on the table and you mix them all together. You don't know which one is which after a while. So this is a way that we try to obfuscate the origin and the path that's traced through the network of these various tokens. So you can imagine the sorts of people that might be interested in that. There's quite a wide constituency, from people like you and I that may not want their governments to know what we're doing, to, let's say, alleged state-sponsored hacking groups that reside in rogue states that don't have access to the conventional financial system, that rely on hacking the shit out of cryptocurrency exchanges and DeFi protocols to pay their bills. And so there's a thing called Tornado Cash on Ethereum, which is one of these privacy mixing protocols. And it recently got sanctioned by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, which is a US regulatory agency, which basically runs like a blacklist of naughty people, naughty entities, people, corporations, institutions, nation states. And they added a smart contract address to this list, which is incredible, because they couldn't find a person to pin it on. So they added an address.
It's kind of sadly validating the personhood thesis we talked about earlier, right? They couldn't find a person, so they sort of gave a smart contract personhood, but they just gave it in a negative way. So it's kind of the sort of sad invalid thesis.
It's also another inversion of code is law, where the law is now treating pieces of code as entities. So in a weird way, the blockchain people won. Because now governments are treating these things like real entities. They gave them personhood.
I mean, just to add to this, also one of the Tornado Cash developers was arrested in the Netherlands and is now still under arrest for
without charge. Yeah. So the water is boiling right now. Things are heating up, and this has already happened. There's already been this kind of discussion and this kind of actions in Bitcoin, and recently Ethereum made a very big technical change away from this energy-intensive consensus mechanism that you might have heard of as blockchain mining or proof of work. Now uses a different mechanism which doesn't require a lot of energy to keep the network going. But the nodes, the entities that verify the transactions and validate them, are now coming under increasing pressure to be compliant with these US regulations. And so we're now in a situation where some of these networks are starting to look less and less like the kind of techno-libertarian Wild West utopia or dystopia, dream or nightmare, as you see, delete as appropriate, and looking a bit more like things that are coming under the purview and the subject of, under the subjugation of nation states.
Yeah, it sounds like the permissionlessness as well as a concept is now kind of giving way to a much more permissioned environment.
Okay, so where should we go now? We did building. What about bridges? So each of these networks, if you think of them like a Bitcoin or Ethereum or Solana or Cardano or Tezos or whatever, they're almost like a little kind of hermetically sealed bubble, like a little community. It has its boundaries, and they're kind of sealed through ownership of the token, or through this kind of these kind of cryptographic gates, or whether you have the token or not means you can participate or not. And so what we've been seeing in the last couple of years are more and more efforts and attempts to start to bridge these protocols. And in the space of DeFi, there's a lot of this kind of thing going on. So you'll find a decentralized finance protocol which might operate across chains. So they're trying to build bridges between these bubbles. And we've seen some interesting stuff happen with, interesting stuff happens every day with those things. Because as you might have seen in the news with the Crimea bridge, bridges are quite vulnerable and they can get attacked.
Yeah, when I'm thinking about bridges beyond these technical bridges, I'm also thinking about social bridges between these bubbles or closed ecosystems. And I'm thinking about bridges with the real world. And I think that's particularly important for artists, creative practitioners, or like even just DAO contributors, people that maybe by playing or experimenting with these technologies have actually the possibility to get some funds or like tokens, even like in the case of DAOs. But the problem is that a lot of this magic internet money or value that exists primarily in the online space is not easily transferable or translated into actual, real world fiat that would enable someone to continue their research or just pay the rent or like, live their life. So I think that it's now at the level of technical bridges that's a lot of interesting things happening, particularly in terms of, again, exploits or like seeing how things can go wrong in this like prototype phase, I guess, of this. But on the other side, I think that, maybe like some more fundamental social bridges haven't really been created, or they're not given maybe the due attention because there's a social layer around all these protocols anyway.
Yeah, I think one of the main questions or one of the main dreams of like sort of like the early space, the early blockchain and also DeFi space was that it will first like work as a currency at one point, which I think is sort of, we can cross off the list of like, goes into like the dead dreams bucket, which is somewhere behind. And then also the question of how certain like financialization of assets could be done like on chain. So if you could like find real world use applications which go beyond like digital assets, but to trade into sort of like material or real world assets. But I think we're seeing now that this itself also is really hard to do because of the laws and the regulations, which are different from any country. And so the idea of just having traded a digital object which is bound to certain rights in like a country is like from a law level quite insane or like quite hard to actually implement as a sort of concept. So it's kind of interesting how this this building bridges between like the sort of like digital token and actually sort of like even physical assets is quite not there yet, or maybe will never come actually.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I guess also like beyond the token itself, like if there's a lot of good intentions within the Web3 space in terms of like really trying to make the world a better place, like trying to solve like large-scale coordination problems from climate to public good to education, etc. But again, I think for Web3 to really produce or generate these positive externalities, you need to have a way to touch the real world as well, like in ways that we haven't really seen yet, I think. That's, still an underexplored, I think.
Yeah, so the bridges we've seen so far, linking the real and the virtual, have been quite primitive. And so I'm thinking of examples like people tried to tokenize real estate or barrels of oil or gold and things like that. And there's all sorts of like technical, economic and psychological problems with that. So I'm thinking back to somebody tried to tokenize bars of silver that would live in a vault. And like that sounds okay when you first think about it. But the thing with storing silver in a vault is like there are costs with the storage, with the security, with like keeping that dry and clean and all the rest of it, the rent. And so you either have to charge people a fee or you have to depreciate the value of the token. People hate both of those things. So there are like psychological barriers to it as well.
Maybe to add to this, I think it's pretty funny that we talk about this in terms of like, okay, you have this valuable resource which could be like stored somewhere in a vault, but actually this is pretty much existing in an art market today. You have like art pieces which are stored in sort of containers.
Free ports.
Yeah, free ports in Zurich or somewhere else where no one can go in, where no one can see these art pieces, and they still getting traded and they don't move. Like the physical art piece doesn't move. It project just stays in this container, but it's like still traded. So if people talk about, yeah, oh no, we have tokenization now, all of this happened before. This is not like something which is like new to like Web3, but this is a dynamic which is going on quite for like a long time, I think.
Yeah, like, and this is why I think like the critique to Web3 and blockchains on the basis of financialization, I think they're not very novel in the sense that we've been living in a context that is financialized for many, many years. And I agree that there should be more imagination towards like, what can these tokens represent? What are they actually about? Given that, yeah, we cross money off the list and a lot of other possibly useful things. So yeah, I think there's still a lot of like to explore in that direction, but yeah.
So let's talk about imagination and like, you know, moving beyond the whatever scarcity economies that we've seen so far. Laura, you're part of a research collective called Other Internet, and you've been writing about public goods, positive sum worlds. Do you want to unpack a little bit of that for us?
Yeah, so this piece called Positive Sum Words was an attempt to try and inspire, I guess, crypto communities into start to think about public goods or large-scale projects in a way that is not just software, like focus on software. And the idea is, the piece kind of like posing a challenge to Web3 operators. And given that, you know, blockchain, like a lot of open source software, is kind of almost considered a public good, like the internet, because it's something that, you know, potentially benefit everybody. Like, but on the other hand, we've seen what happened with Web 2 and platforms and the negative externalities that a lot of these platforms have generated. And so the idea was like, yeah, kind of try to challenge the crypto communities and be like, okay, if you want to generate positive externalities, for crypto to really generate positive externalities, they need to be a bit more ambitious in the scale of like thinking about how to approach these problems. And that's, yeah, that was like maybe an early attempt that is currently now continuing and being developed into probing at these institutional imaginaries that can emerge out of this space. We are seeing a lot of the same old kind of like patterns that are replicated into thinking about institutions, but I think that that's like the wrong mental model. Like certainly, you know, like a alternative, like peer-to-peer or more horizontal economic and social system is not going to be based on the model of a central bank or on the model of the state as we know it, because the context within which these protocols and infrastructures exist is something that is very different from the geographical bounded, you know, like what we know of like nation states, kind of types of institutions. So yeah, there's a lot there to explore. I think Black Swan is in its capacity trying to provide alternative institutional imaginaries for like what could cultural institutions look like if they adopted or like participated within a different network or a different ways of, you know, like providing resources, supporting artists. Yeah, but I personally would want to see a lot of these experiments and see which one sticks in the end, because we're still in a really early phase at that point. Where, yeah, we've gone through the same old, and now we're really trying to, yeah, move. I don't know, beyond that, or like the pendulum is swinging again in a more imaginative direction, perhaps.
Yeah, it does seem that as we kind of cycle through technology paradigms, when we're in the early stages of those, we tend to be borrowing a lot of the concepts, ideas, imaginaries from the previous iterations, the previous generations. There's this notion of the skeuomorph, which I think is really helpful here. And like, think about when you sit at your computer, you use a mouse and you move windows around on your desktop. So like we're still at this kind of stage where we're still, well, actually we never moved beyond that stage with the computer, but like we have a potential, an opportunity with this organization, institution, building the tools and the framework to do those kinds of things, to move beyond what we've had before. So yeah, here for that. Okay, what about immersion? Immersion, yeah. So that was I think the slipperiest word of the 7 that we chose, and we thought that we could connect this to the sort of the tribes or the network states or these kind of upstart institutions that form around these protocols, and the people that find themselves kind of the adherents or the people inside these systems. So I think that ideology is nothing new. Like, we live in a society, we're here in Poland, there's churches everywhere. They're very beautiful. Like, I wonder how they got so beautiful. Like, how did they get all that capital? Like, I wonder. But yeah, so we see these kind of ideologies in these technological systems as well. And where should we go with this?
It's a hard one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's humans gonna human. Like, again, we have these technical systems. They provide these new kind of abstractions, so we sort of see the humans behind them less than we used to, but they're still there. And humans have, we're bags of meat and water. We have biases. We have opinions. We have kind of blind spots. And when we build these things, we might not be so aware of the things that we're rushing into. I'm reminded of a book I read this year by David S. Noble called The Religion of Technology, which is from the late 90s. So it's actually a little bit before a lot of the Web 2 stuff happened. And he was actually talking about biotech in there. Like, all of this kind of designer genetics, these like custom genetically modified organisms. There was a guy called Craig S. Venter around the 90s. I don't know if you guys remember him. He was designing synthetic organisms and trying to patent their genetic codes. And the book goes through various kinds of examples around different kind of models of innovation. And he was tying this back actually to a very Christian imaginary that we as humans fell from grace. And ever since that, we've been trying to recapture the godlikeness of, the man has been trying to recapture the godlikeness of his image. And I do wonder if there's something in there around the kind of the zeal and the fervor we see around the people that really believe in these technologies.
I mean, I think there is like, if we look at the space, there is like a huge difference between like actual technology and sort of like narratives, which are sort of kind of flying around or kind of hovering around these technologies, and which at certain points tend to make people believe in certain things, as in almost like a religious belief in certain things, while like the technology is maybe not there or maybe will never be there. This is why I also like to describe certain like token systems almost as like infrastructures of desire, rather than sort of like actual sort of like technical infrastructures, or maybe it's also kind of like the same. Maybe it was always the same in a sense. But I think with these technologies, it becomes even more clear that like all of these things are essentially driven by people or driven by sort of certain like agency, which is really bound to also a certain like limitation of imagination, as we talked about. So yeah, if we look, for example, at like how meme coins work, right? They like almost all the time, like Dogecoin or things like this, right? They're like almost always like a really kind of distinct like idea, which then get like tied to like a specific desire of, okay, it will moon, it will get like 100x, right? And this shows also how the whole, how this is capturing a certain like imagination, which essentially needs a really precarious sort of like idea of how value gets generated under it, which is essentially like no one goes anymore and buy like a stock because you don't care if your stock is like 110 or like 120 euros more in like, I don't know, 5 years or something, which was like the model like 10 years ago. But now it becomes this like condition under which everything has to be like really extremely exaggerated. Like, okay.
Well, if my cup of coffee is increasing in price by 10% per day, why shouldn't my shitcoin?
Exactly. Why shouldn't my shitcoin 100x in like I don't know, 1 hour or something? And it really becomes this sort of like almost like get rich or die trying thing, which is bizarre if you think of this as a sort of model for investments.
Yeah, and like we're in a bear market, as we talk about in terms of the market cycles in the crypto space right now, which means we're in a down market. The prices are down. Bitcoin is down 70% from its high. Other ones are down more than that, you know, largely across the board. And so, so people, like when the prices are going up, everyone thinks they're a genius. Everyone thinks they're Warren Buffett. You know, I bought shitcoin X. It went up 20 times. I am the king of the universe. But when they go down, and everyone's in that, we all made it together on the way up. But on the way down, it becomes clear that we can't all get rich together. Markets are largely zero sum. There are winners and losers on either side. I mean, despite the fact that these are like, you know, people are printing their own tokens and they are kind of magical money machines, we can't all make it. Like, that's not how the market works, and nobody will tell you that, because like that's not how you get someone to buy your coin. That's just the reality of that.
I was also thinking, as we talked about religions, desire, number go up, there's a lot of cultish behaviors around this like DAOs or protocols, or basically around these tokens that maybe don't have a specific use or function or meaning yet, but I think what's appealing for a lot of people is the possibility to project whatever they want into this and find a sense of belonging that maybe they couldn't find in the atomized world that we live in. And so we are beginning to see, or like we are seeing again, a resurgence of religion-like behaviors that really fuel a lot of these protocols, a lot of this speculation. It's almost like a divine kind of mode of engaging with the market, really, and with the
I think also it has to do with like collective identity building, in a sense, that like you have certain like identities get so often or so fast captured that like finding these like interesting and new ways of like which had to be like deciphered first, it sort of becomes almost like game of like identity building, I think.
Yeah, actually, I find the example of Bitcoin and Bitcoiners and their identity really interesting. I was in the Bitcoin space for many years. You can watch videos of me online at technical conferences doing things like this with the believers. And here's something interesting about Bitcoiners. So they say that they're really against the state and they're really anarchist and they're really into privacy and they, live under the shroud of darkness. But if you go to a conference, like it could be in Bogota, it could be in Krakow, it could be in London, they are dressed head to toe in shit with the Bitcoin logo all over it, which is basically saying, mug me, kill me, mug me. And so you have to ask yourself, how much do they really believe in the values that are kind of ascribed to those belief systems, network, tribes, cults, whatever you want to call it, and how much of it is just like this kind of signaling in-out group signaling mechanism. And let's face it, humans are tribal creatures, like we've always been tribal creatures. And these technologies are kind of just new scaffolds with which to project and build those things with. Maybe we open it up. Yeah, I don't know how much more time we've got. Maybe we open up for questions now. I don't know if anybody's got questions. There should be a microphone around somewhere, I think. Yes. Maybe over here first. Yeah.
I think so. It's just really, really great talk. So yeah, thinking about Terra O and the ecological impact of cryptocurrency is like always foregrounded, and there's been a couple recent projects to try to use cryptocurrency to deal with that problem. One like Klima DAO. So I just wonder if there's any thinking around the potentials of that, or is that kind of like maybe not the right move?
Oh my God, we get to talk about Klima DAO. I forgot about that. Paul, do you want to start with Klima DAO?
I start with the promise of Klima DAO, and then let's see where we go. So I think one of the main questions when we look at what the ecology, or like how ecology and sort of these sort of accounting systems, right? Like a decentralized ledger is essentially sort of also like an accounting system. How these things like engage with each other. It's clear that that we're not at the level where it can engage trustless. So you always need some sort of like middleman in this thing. And this is kind of like a technical problem, but essentially a blockchain is like a closed system, right? It can't get data from anywhere without someone injecting data in it. And then it becomes also the question like, why should you trust the person injecting data in it? So like everything which comes from the outside in a blockchain, which is not like inherent in the transaction system, is need always some sort of like trust or some sort of like institution or some sort of like verification entity which is sort of guiding this. So when we look at how, for example, carbon offset credits are generated, or how like biodiversity certificates are generated, they're always generated through some sort of like agency, through some sort of like either non-governmental agency or some sort of like consulting or like land sort of regenerative agency. But they are always they have always their sort of like different metrics and different sort of ways how they identify certain either like biodiversity or carbon, how much carbon is binded to like certain land. So the promise of Klima DAO in the beginning is kind of like, okay, we're gonna take these already verified sort of like credits and like just replicate them on chain, right? The main technical problem they have is that there is no legal framework which allows for this, which makes it like quite hard to like see where this is going like long term. But I think they're like researching now a little bit on this, how they can bring this into a more like legal framed realm. Essentially, I think it's a question of how do we verify a certain state of ecology. And this, for me personally, from like my artistic practice, has to be something which has to be like rather like local, rather biospecific, and rather community-driven than universal and bureaucratic in a sense. So I'm not like 100% sure if the idea of having like a kind of this one ledger and you have this one sort of like climate carbon credit system, if that is actually something I would like find good or like stand behind, essentially. Does this answer the question?
I think we answered part of it. Laura, would you like to say something maybe about the economics of Klima DAO?
No, actually no.
Okay, I'll do that.
Isn't
Leave you the discussion.
Isn't Klima DAO like an Ohm fork?
It's our own fork.
Yeah, it's a fork of Ohm. So there's a DeFi protocol called Ohm, which many others replicated and forked and used the same economic model, which has been described charitably by people that are fans of it and like it and use it as Ponzinomics. Like they actually use that term.
But what I wanted to add is that I think to tackle some of these big issues, such as like climate or like, I think it disconnects again to the question of maybe institutional imaginaries and what types of, I mean, I don't think that a single protocol is gonna address this like global situation. And I think that, as probably as you've learned with Terra Zero, like there needs to be a situated approach to a lot of these things, and so that's where I think that again the mental model that we have of the institution that tackles this issue and this other issue is something that I don't think that can work the same way in this supposed decentralized environment because it's so distributed. Then you need a collective action of maybe a lot of different products, even like things that maybe don't have anything to do with like climate per se, like all these DeFi protocols. Why they don't allocate some of their treasuries to, I don't know, like come up with like a bit more of a sustained and ambitious agenda to address these issues of KlimaDAO wanted to basically GameStop the carbon credit market. That's the goal, which is like, okay, it's
Wall Street bets for the climate.
It sounded great when it came out, obviously.
I mean, there could be also the critical question towards KlimaDAO, like how much did it help that they like literally bought like low effort carbon credits and that like replicated them on chain, right? I mean, obviously they kind of like squeezed it, but they also like were then, or they also further kind of were positive for the production of new carbon credits, which were also like this low effort. So I'm kind of like a little bit biased or like a little bit like skeptical.
Also at one point, I believe, just before the Ponzi of KlimaDAO kind of collapsed, it started moving the global prices of carbon credits like significantly. So then there was all of a sudden, there was like news articles on Bloomberg about this like, insane climate Ponzi on Ethereum that is making carbon really expensive. And like, that sounds like in principle, great, carbon's more expensive, then like emitters will be disincentivized to emit. But as we've discussed time and again in our conversation, there's all of these kind of unforeseen consequences, second order externalities to like, introducing market logics where they weren't there before.
Thanks.
Thank you. There's another question just over there.
Great talk, three of you. Thanks so much. So I work in Web3 cybersecurity area, and although it becomes like another third party that stands between the provider of service, we're speaking about like widely available B2C type of companies that are blockchain based. So what is your outlook? And I would like each of you to answer on all this audit, like smart contract audit providers, bug bounties. Is it enough to leverage and balance the amount of bad actors? Is it gonna really help the blockchain ecosystem to stay in its own bubble, some sort, and in a good way, that it's gonna be intact from all these complex systems, hierarchies that government and governance brings? I've only started work in cybersecurity. Know quite a few about crypto, and also I want to get sort of not inspiration, but guidance. What should I look for in the next couple of years? Speaking of cybersecurity, thank you.
I mean, maybe I'll just start real quick by saying something about so like smart contracts. I don't think we actually defined them, but you can think of them as like little bits of code, programmable scripts or something like that. So these are little bits of code that live on the blockchain. Once you put them on the blockchain, they kind of stay there. So like it's important to get them right. And, we still use, so Ethereum is the predominant network, and the EVM, which is the virtual computer that it runs on Ethereum, and Solidity, which is a JavaScript-like programming language which that uses, are quite primitive by today's standards. So Solidity is kind of like it's similar to JavaScript. There's all kinds of like weird idiosyncrasies, gotchas, things that can go wrong with it. So there's lots of potential bugs in there. And so the idea of bug bounties is always good, but then when you apply incentives, then you can kind of, you have these second order effects. I would also say something about smart contract audits, which I know Paul can speak about more than I can. They're really expensive. So like to get your smart contract audited, if you've got like a crypto art project or a decentralized finance project, and you want your contracts to get audited so that somebody will give them a stamp, a seal of approval to say that they're safe or they've been thoroughly tested, that can cost you like 6 figures. They can be like 100,000 euros or more. And so then that limits the scale of the actors that can engage in those kinds of security measures. And I know, Paul, you write smart contracts, mostly in the artistic context. Do you want to tell us about your experiences?
Yes, but I also want to make a comment first on the whole market. And I think it's really funny that Ethereum is essentially like the biggest bug hunt or the biggest sort of like bug thing, or like bug, what is it, hunting, you say bug hunting?
Bug bounty?
Bug bounty, yeah, sorry. That it's like the biggest bug bounty ever, because essentially everything on Ethereum is public. So it means that if there is a bug somewhere, there's probably money which can be stolen, or like ether which can be stolen. So essentially every contract which is not hacked after like half a year is pretty much unhackable, because like you have all the time a 24-hour hacking contest, which is providing the biggest incentives for people to hack there.
And some of them are not just people, like bots scripts doing this as well.
So like we see pretty much something where we build like a stable sort of informational system by failing constantly, which is amazing. Like there's so much stuff going wrong like every week that you can see that like what survives is pretty much done. I mean, it's pretty much you can't hack it. It will be probably never be hacked, which I think is like the most amazing way of like testing software, which is in production and with a lot of money behind. So if something like, so I'm like totally convinced of this, because it's literally this like, if there is a bug, the contract will die in fire in like 5 minutes. So yeah, I'm pretty like optimistic in this sense that it's like the most, probably one of the craziest ways in like testing out code live in production with money behind. So saying this, I think this system of like constantly failing and constantly iterating will probably go on and will get more crazy. And I think like it's pretty much like professionalized now and will get even more professionalized in the future with people, doing basically code analysis and like kind of this decompiling things like really.
I just want to say something really quick to disagree with you, Paul, because Laura told me about this amazing newsletter called rekt.news, R-E-K-T, and they send you an email every time an Ethereum protocol gets hacked, and you get these emails every day or almost every day. And the last email was about 2 things. One was Mango, which we discussed yesterday, but the other one was Temple DAO, where a vulnerable contract that was several months old just got hacked.
But this was amazing. Like no one looked at this function. It was literally, it's not even like a hack. It's someone just used
exploit.
Someone like used this function. But I think that's great. I mean, okay, maybe it takes sometimes like longer, but I mean, it will lead to like contracts which are essentially like not, which are really not hackable. Like we have like a contract, we deployed like a contract in 2016, which is still running. It like still makes like or like probably 2018, which still runs and still like makes like transfers. And this thing is there like as long as the Ethereum network will exist. And I think that's kind of also a cool thing.
So have you got one of the oldest unhacked contracts on Ethereum, Paul?
That was kind of what I wanted to say as well, that I think auditing and bounties are definitely really good and probably going to continue, because this whole world of smart contracts is an adversarial environment to begin with. So you really have to, try all you can to break it, to prove that it actually works. But then there may be something that is also missing, which is like what happens when instead protocols really get wrecked and like people really lose money and their savings, and there's nothing like, so the question of accountability maybe comes back in terms of like how to deal with these things when they happen. Is it at the level of single protocols? Is it at the level of like, again, some kind of like, I don't know,
insurance?
Web3, like, I don't know.
I mean, like we just mentioned Mango. We were talking about this over dinner the other night. There was one of these decentralized finance protocols running on a network called Solana, and the attacker, I don't know how much they took, a lot. And then they wrote back with a proposal to the network, which was, you've got this massive treasury, and so why don't you use that, like all your money, your kind of like whatever startup capital, what the founders thought they were going to retire on, why don't you use that to pay back the community, and I'll give you a small amount back. And so essentially they drove a wedge between the community and the team, which I thought was amazing. Like, this is like master psychology. So that person should be a Bond supervillain. Any more questions? One at the front here.
Hello, I have a question to Laura. So you were talking about Swan DAO, and I wanted to ask if you can give an example, to go outside our bubble, because I'm also from Web3, so it's great to talk, like to hear also an insider talk, but we have a lot of artists here, and I wanted to ask of a real life implementation for artists actually who could use what you guys are building and designing. If you can give me an example, some things we've been observing, like Gitcoin or Ukraine DAO, that really have real life implementations. So.
So maybe just a quick introduction again, or like just explain a little bit the basic mechanics of Black Swan. There are active members that are the artists, creative practitioners that are part of the system and that, basically decide collectively or like peer review each other's proposals and like work together in the process, and then basically vote or decide how to use resources that can be financial resources or can be like physical resources that are pledged by silent stakeholders. So that's how we call them. Silent stakeholders are basically traditional institutions or organizations or spaces that maybe have, like an idle space or a residency or like a slot for an exhibition or material that they can also pledge, or mentorship even, they can pledge within the system. And then like on the basis of these resources, people would submit proposals on how to, basically what to do with them. And so something that we did last year at the Kunstwerke in Berlin was a 36 hours role-played hackathon where 40 people, like artists of different, like more and less established, were working together in this 36 hours, like role-playing and inhabiting this world where you had these different organizational forms that were kind of playing with and against each other on, like on the basis of this script or like traits that, or story that we provided. So there were these 4 organizations that were representing the archetypes of organizational forms. It was based or inspired by a theory of Kojin Karatani, who is a Marxist historian, and he has this idea of basically his reworking of the Marxist theory on the basis of modes of exchange and no mode of production. And so this organization represented as 4 archetypical mode of exchange: the gift, the commodity, the mode of brute force of the state, and the mode of the venture, which is what Karatani kind of alludes to as this like new community, like built, like kind of religious community built on the basis of the commodity economy. And so we had these 4 organizations that spent this 1.5 day like trading with each other some resources that they had, and these resources then corresponded to the actual resources that some organizations and institutions within Berlin had pledged to provide. And then at the end of this hackathon, we came back to the consensual reality, and these groups then had the opportunity to actually use this web app that we've developed. At the moment, it's still in beta, so we're running like a closed experiment with certain projects. We also worked with this Sphere, who is a performing arts collective based out of Stockholm, and with CTM in Berlin, we ran another of these cycles with sound artists and musicians. And so the idea is both to build some of these tools that we want to release, making sure that they're tested and audited and everything. But then on the other side is also like mobilizing the actual networks that exist in different localities. So because the project was born in Berlin, at the moment we've been working a lot with organizations based out of Berlin, but the goal is to bring these systems or these patterns to the level that then can be replicated also in other localities. And ideally, we get to a point where these localities can also connect, maybe. And the idea is to, bring in or engage institutions according to different rules. So preventing them to decide how their resources that they pledge are going to be used, and leaving that to the artists themselves. Now, the artists of this experiment that I was telling you about at Cave are in the process of utilizing these resources, and we are probably beginning to see some of the results at the end of the year or in the early next year.
Thank you.
All right, I think that's all we've got time for. So thanks very much for your time. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Paul. Cheers.